did you notice that was very different between those two examples? Anybody? The what? Yes. Oh, no, not about, it's not about the research field. No, sorry. It's about the style of writing. Remember I said you don't need to understand the science. Just look to see if you can understand the difference between the styles of writing. And what do you see? You asked me a question before lunch that's exactly this, right? So what do we see? What's number one? Right, yes. Yes, thank you. All right. By coincidence, he asked me a question before lunch, which this example is exactly about. Number one, what does it say? We did this. We used this method. We decided to do that. We did something else. Whereas example number two is passive. The following methods were used. Have another look and see if you can notice that difference. I think the first word in number one is we, right? Yes. What do you think about we or I? Do you like that? Why don't you like it? Yes.
So it's easy to use we and I.
It is easy to use we and I, but we tend not to do that. These are real papers that you're reading, so there's nothing right or wrong about this. But very typically, scientific style uses the second example, which is what we call a passive example. And it does that because when you have we or I, there is what we call implied bias. That the focus is on the people that did the research rather than the focus being on the research itself, which is example number two. So when you read, I did this, I did that, or we did this, we did that, you think, gosh, it's all about them. It's not really about the research. So what errors of judgment did they make? They were so focused on themselves, were they really thinking about the research? Now I am being extreme in my comments. But in scientific writing, we normally use the passive voice and put the focus on the research, not the focus on the scientist. So I think that answers in part the discussion we had before lunch. So I put some examples in the handout. We use simulation modeling to evaluate plant growth, as opposed to simulation modeling was used to evaluate plant growth. The researchers collected data from all sites weekly. Data were collected from all sites weekly. So you can see the emphasis here and here is on the science. Where you see we use simulation modeling, you immediately think, well, what else could they have used? Why are they telling me that? Whereas here, it's a straightforward statement. Simulation modeling was used. You can make up your own mind about whether that's appropriate, but you're not thinking about the scientists themselves, you're thinking about the scientific method that was used. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. If you want to use first person, I or we, that's okay. Journals will publish papers with that style. But more typically, the passive form with the emphasis on the research and not on the scientists, is the normal way of scientific writing. I think economists in particular, which is the first example there, they tend to use first person more than biological scientists would. So again, different disciplines have different styles.
How about both?
You would not normally mix it. You would not normally mix it up. You would typically, if you're going to use passive, you would use passive throughout. If you want to use both, you would tend to use the wording in that slide. The researchers, not I or we, the researchers. So that you're neutralizing it. You're not focusing it on the individual or on the group. You're using a more generic term. So that's the researchers, however, decided that would be fine if you had to use it. Now, you made a comment a few minutes ago about paragraphs getting long and sentences getting long. Here's an important piece of information. Throughout your whole manuscript, keep your sentences short. English is difficult enough. So don't try and write long sentences. Keep the sentences short. You can always join them up afterwards if you want to. But it's much easier to write nice, concise, short sentences. Particularly in the materials and methods section, where you're describing the activities that you went through in the research that you did. So keep sentences short. That applies to the other sections in the paper, in the manuscript as well. It's very good advice. Keep thinking of that. And if your supervisors see you with one sentence that's a whole paragraph, then that's very bad. And that happens. And I know that's difficult with Thai, because you don't think in short sentences. You think in flows of logic. But in English, if you can keep your sentences short, I think you'll find it will be easier for you. Another thing that is very difficult for Thai people is use punctuation correctly and efficiently. We'll look at some examples of that in a moment. Be careful, however, with punctuation, because a comma in the wrong place can change the meaning. So you need to be careful with how you use punctuation. Back to my favorite topic, use subheadings. Now in examples 1 and 2 that you looked at before, example 1 uses subheadings. And when I've run this course before and said what's the difference between 1 and 2, several people said, please, they use subheadings in number 1, which is correct. And you can see those subheadings break up the text and make it easier to follow. So think about that, use subheadings. We'll talk about connecting phrases a little more later. Try not to repeat things, particularly try not to use the same word several times in the one sentence. And I'll show you some examples of that. Oh, here we go. Right, short sentences. 3 grapefruit cultivars, Forster, Hudson and Redflesh, were used in the study. Full stop. 3 cultivars were used. Important piece of information, nice short sentence. 3 cultivars were used, full stop. 3 fruit from each tree were picked 4 times, full stop. In this case, a semicolon, a colon. But it could have been a full stop. Now, when you were writing something like that, you probably would have made all that one sentence. But try and keep those sentences short. They were picked 4 times, colon, and then the 4 times as 4 dates. separated by commas, with the appropriate abbreviations for each month, which will depend on the journal that you published in as to how that abbreviation is written. Plants at the Olsen farm were spaced 1.2 metres apart in rows 3 metres apart. Full stop. Those on the O'Brien farm were spaced 1.2 metres apart and rows about 4 metres apart. Full stop. Again, I could have written all of that as one sentence, but it's two very clear pieces of information in each short sentence. So that's a couple of examples of short sentences. Punctuation, difficult for you, I know. 4 tropical fruit were used. Colon, durian and longan, collected from the Chiang Mai field site, semicolon, and avocado and rambutan, comma, collected at Pattaya. I can't give you an English lesson now, but there we have colons, semicolons, and commas, breaking up the flow of information. We could have had a full stop here and said 2 tropical fruit were used from Chiang Mai, colon, durian and longan, full stop. 2 other tropical fruit, avocado and rambutan, were collected at Pattaya. That would have been acceptable. But this is demonstrating how you can, if you know enough about the use of colons and semicolons and commas, break up some information and keep the logic of the sentence flowing. Subheadings are very useful for not only dividing up the materials and methods section, but the results section, and as we'll see in some examples tomorrow, the discussion section as well. And often they'll be the same subheadings repeated in each of those sections, so that you're signalling to the reader where to find that same information as they flow through the manuscript. Enzyme assays in the materials and methods, enzyme assays in the results, enzyme assays in the discussion. Nice simple subheading, common throughout those different sections in the manuscript, very easy to flow through and find the information on enzyme assays. They are typically, subheadings are typically put in italics or in bold font, and you should look at the journal to see what their style is. So here's some examples. Subheading, plant material, it's in bold, and it's in the line. It's not a separate line for that subheading. It's in the line, and it's indented. That sounds very fussy, but journals will reject your manuscript unless you follow their style. And if it's a matter of hitting the indent button, then please do that when you're preparing your draft and getting it right. Otherwise, they'll send it back and ask you to correct it. Here's italics followed by a dash. Again, some journals use that style. Here's another one, italics, but on a separate line. No full stop, followed by the subject matter, and this is indented, that is not. I've deliberately chosen 3 very different examples to show you that they are all used, they're all okay, but it depends on the journal that you're publishing in as to how the subheadings are displayed. It's like materials and methods. Most journals will have that centered and in bold, but some journals have it left justified. Whatever the journal is that you're using, use their style and get it right, otherwise they'll send the manuscript back. Remember what I said this morning, every time a manuscript comes back, you waste about a month. You haven't got a month to waste in your careers. Right, another few examples. I talked before about connecting phrases. where you're reading through a series of sentences about some subjects and you see a word that connects one sentence with the next sentence. So if you're doing tissue culture, cotyledonary explants from the region, etc., etc., these explants were managed in some way. Another example here. Feeding individual leaves with a solution containing N15 is a technique that has been widely used. The potential of the technique, or this technique. So you're using connecting phrases from one sentence to the other to help the reader flow through the logic of the information that you're presenting. So they know here you're still talking about explants. They know here that you're picking up on the technique. Don't say it. If it is the technique, say the technique. You're reinforcing the fact that you're still talking about the technique. Or still talking about, in this case, the explants. So try and use connecting phrases. It's not repetitious. It's helpful. You're not using it a lot, but you're using it enough to help the reader flow through the information. I talked about avoiding repetition. Now here's some examples on the left-hand side that perhaps you would write and not think that there was anything wrong with them. The data were collected and they were analysed using ANOVA techniques. You don't need that repetition. The data were collected and analysed. You don't need to say they were. The data were collected and correlations were calculated. The data were collected and correlations calculated. The data were collected and were analysed using. The data collected were analysed using. So try and avoid repetition and simplify your sentences. Okay, so after you've written something, have another look at it, give it to a colleague, give it to somebody else in the lab, and say, do you think this is okay, or can I improve that? Always look for possible abbreviations that will shorten the sentence. Most of us find the materials and methods section as the easiest section to write in your whole paper. Agree with that? Yeah? Because you're very familiar with the work. You probably know your methods better than anything else in your paper, and they are fairly routine. So it's pretty easy to write, particularly if you're in a field where lots of papers are written on that subject, because you can see how other people have done it. So don't spend all your time when you're fresh writing materials and methods. All right, wait until you're tired. Wait until it's after lunch. Wait until it's 10 o'clock at night, when you've run out of energy to write the other sections in your paper, and go and write some easy materials and methods sections. Resist doing those sections when you are fresh. Only write the materials and methods after you've worked out what story you're going to tell in that results section. No point in writing a whole lot about methods and then you decide you're not going to write that up after all. So remember, this morning we talked about sorting out the story that you're going to tell, write the results section. Now we're saying only report on the methods that were critical to those particular results that you're reporting on. I'm not interested in all the other stuff that you did if you're not reporting on it. Even if you might have spent a lot of time doing that other work, it's not relevant unless you're reporting results from that method. So you only include those methods and materials that were critical to doing the work that's covered in the results section that you're reporting on. Don't put in other methods that you never, for which you never show any data. Equally, don't forget to cover all of the methods that are relevant to the results that you presented. I looked at a paper the other day, and some people said we calculated the calorific value of the compounds in the tissues that we measured. They didn't tell me how they did it. They forgot completely to put that method in their materials and methods section. So whatever data you present in results must have a materials and methods section associated with it. Right, any questions about materials and methods or about results? Getting through this far too quickly.